It was exactly 20 years ago, on one of those grey June Joburg mornings, that we set out on a ceramics expedition to KwaZulu-Natal.
Good morning, group.
Our diverse group of part-time potters included an architect, a journalist, a vet, a gallery owner, and several ceramic students of varied age and experience. All were amateurs, in the true meaning of the word, not inept, but in love, pursuing a passion for pottery from the heart. All had studied with me, either formally or informally, at some point over the past 25 years. Some had also travelled with me on ceramic study tours to the UK and China. We knew each other well, but this would be our last journey together. I would soon be relocating to the United States.
Have you got a spade? Come on, come on. I've already said to me, there's plenty of movement. Yeah. Why? This is a Mercedes.
With a brief stop to retrieve the camera from Frank, we were on our way. The sun was coming up as we got onto the highway to Natal, leaving behind Johannesburg and a number of wary partners. Besides Franz, the driver of our hired bus, Ati was the sole male participant. In the opinion of those left behind, we were a bunch of crazy women, heading off on a recklessly optimistic excursion into unfamiliar and possibly hostile territory. They were right, but I believed there was much to be gained. The Highveld landscape is flat, monochromatic, and fairly monotonous in winter, so this seems like a good time to share the backstory to our journey. The date was 2003. Growing up in South Africa, a former British colony, as far back as I can remember, we were enthralled to imported culture. Everything beautiful, desirable, hip, real, in music, fashion, art, ceramics, came from overseas, from somewhere else. But in the years following the regime change in 1994, there was a brief window where deconstructing such concepts seemed necessary and possible. My medium was ceramics education. My hope for this journey was to explore underlying assumptions and enlarge perceptions of ceramic practice in a post-apartheid milieu. In a quest for authenticity, in our state of liminal identity, I wanted to share with the group a comparative and immersive experience of two seminal pottery traditions. Firstly, the imported Anglo-Oriental tradition of wheel-thrown reduction-fired stoneware and porcelain. And secondly, the low-fired hand-building tradition of indigenous Zulu makers. The concept and practice of studio pottery was imported to South Africa from Britain in the 1950s and 60s by way of the Anglo-Oriental ethics and aesthetics of the Leach tradition. Though Bernard Leach never visited South Africa, his pervasive writings initiated students of ceramics into the technology, culture, and philosophy of Japan, informing the perception and practice of South African studio pottery up into the early 1980s. Embedded in Leach's anti-industrial canon, which included medieval English earthenware and Korean and Chinese stonewares, was the early 20th century Japanese philosophy of Mingei, which elevated folk craft to the highest echelons of aesthetic achievement. Mingei ceramics were invariably utilitarian, wheel-thrown, and high-fired. The fetishization of these rustic stonewares was initiated by Japanese tea masters in the 16th century. Through his English translation of The Unknown Craftsman by Japanese aesthetic philosopher Suetsu Yanagi, Leach transmitted an essentially Buddhist perspective on art and beauty to an international audience. Challenging Western convention in the face of a rapidly industrializing Japan, Yanagi eulogized simple peasant utensils made by unknown makers from the agrarian cultures of Korea and Japan as objects born and not made. I first encountered local pots embodying Yanagi's concept of objects that were born and not made in 1993 at an exhibition of indigenous South African ceramics from the collection of the University of the Witwatersrand. Though they differed from the Japanese archetypes in form, surface, function, and technique, it was a revelation to recognize in these utilitarian hand-built pots, commonly made by often anonymous black potters, the basic tenets of Minge. That extraordinary beauty resides in the ordinary, in common everyday objects, the work of skilled but often unknown makers. The simple elegance of these forms also called to mind the Japanese adjective shibui, the aesthetic of studied restraint, introduced to the West by Yanagi and Leach. Literally translated as astringent, the taste of an unripe persimmon. The 7 elements of the noun shibuza are simplicity, implicity, modesty, naturalness, everydayness, imperfection, and silence. For me, this was a wake-up call. Like many South African potters, my infatuation with imported archetypes had blinkered me to the intrinsic qualities of local ceramic production. Invited by the Potters Association to curate a selection of ceramics to represent South Africa at the International Ceramics Biennale in Cairo in 1994, I included the work of rural potters Nesta Nala, Bina Gumede, and Rebecca Matiba, with pieces by 3 well-known urban studio potters. The contrast was radical. The work of Peter Mtombeni and Ray Wessels epitomized the technological and aesthetic shift that had occurred here in the 1980s. During that decade, South Africa was increasingly ostracized by Britain in protest at the apartheid regime. American media and culture swiftly filled the gap. Ceramic discourse was indelibly impacted. Multivalent form, low-fired whiteware, slip casting, and amico underglaze became the tools with which the lowly status of ceramics as craft, epitomized by the high-fired Anglo-Oriental style, could be challenged. Ceramics as art and postmodern maximalism prevailed. South Africa emerged from its pariah status in 1994. By that time, as if in dialectic opposition to the excesses of the 80s, Zen minimalism had emerged as an international design trend. In British ceramics, this propelled a resurgence of interest in the essence of Anglo-Orientalism that had gone so far out of favor that it was ripe for revival. Leading the revision was scholar, author, and potter Edmund de Waal, whose celadon glazed porcelain catapulted the Song dynasty standard of beauty, espoused by Leach in a potter's book, right into late 20th century minimalism. Ironically, Leach's fiercest critic, with his Japan-honed sensibility and very English restraint, De Waal emerged as perhaps the truest exponent of Anglo-Oriental style yet. De Waal's astringent, or one might say shubui, aesthetic rekindled my own interest in Anglo-Orientalism and led to an inspiring experience of Japanese tea in 1997 on one of my ceramic study tours to London. In 1998, I designed a comprehensive educational program of workshops and exhibitions called The Way of Tea, to introduce the tenets and aesthetics of tea to the South African art and design community. Seeking local relevance, I discovered an unanticipated correlation between the Zen ritual of the Japanese tea ceremony and the serving of beer in Zulu culture. This presented an intriguing opportunity to showcase utensils from these two apparently opposite traditions. Curating an exhibition called Strange Brew, I juxtaposed Zulu beerwares with Japanese-inspired teawares made by the few local studio potters still referencing Anglo-Oriental style. The contrast between the cultivated rusticity and gestural asymmetry of the glazed wheel-thrown stoneware and the robust elegance and rhythmic symmetry of the hand-built unglazed beerwares was eye-opening and fascinating, if a little ahead of its time. It would take a decade for Zen to become a household word in South Africa. Five years later, by the time of our trip in 2003, formerly unknown Zulu potters were being acknowledged, celebrated, and researched, and the local market for rustic stoneware had all but died. Ceramics, as it is wont to do, presented an interesting reflection of the changing socio-cultural reality of the country. The makers of Zulu beerwares were black and female, while protagonists of Anglo-Orientalism, their number dwindling, were generally white and male. Perhaps it was the echo of Yanagi's philosophy of non-duality, or simply the allure of Edmund de Waal's minimal porcelain. But to me, the way forward seemed to lie in embracing the imported and the indigenous traditions as complementary, not mutually exclusive. So I devised this ceramic study tour that encapsulated both. I called it Venture into the Interior, ceramic masterclasses, and a shared journey of personal discovery. It would be an opportunity to venture to the heart of the discourse, to discover who we really were, what was really ours, and what really mattered, ceramically speaking, in the so-called new South Africa. We had just 7 days. Nikki and Clarissa mapped out the route.
From Johannesburg, all the way down the N3 through the Free State, into KwaZulu-Natal, all the way there's Durban, then we're going somewhere around there, Kranskop.
In total, we travelled 1,700 kilometres via Durban to Kranskop and then on to the Natal Midlands.
Not quite sure what A is 1540 kilos, B is 260 kilos, C is 680 kilos.
It was no wonder that our combined weight was well over 4,000 kilos. Travelling with us were the bisque teapots and cups that participants had made at Frank Robenheimer's studio in Johannesburg a few weeks prior to departure. Starting in Durban that afternoon, our itinerary included meeting and interacting with well-known urban and rural professional potters.
I went in about 6 at
Rodney Blumenfeld,
Class in England. And
Marta Zettler,
maybe 3 pieces of
Mama Esther and the Magwaza family, Nesta Nala,
of Sotheby's last year, buying pots to
Ian Glennie
lots of foreigners.
What temperature do you get in there?
and Lindsay
Well, we hope
Scott.
to make 1350 centigrade if we...
After 3 days of instruction in Zulu pot making and 11 hours of wood firing to cone 13, the group would be able to draw their own conclusions. We stopped halfway for brunch. As expected, at the tourist gift shop, the deterioration of traditional craft to mass-produced curios was on full display. A word about the terrible quality of the camera footage. By 2003, I had spent what seemed like a lifetime engaged in the study and practice of ceramics, but this was the first time I had ever held a video camera. Knowing that the trip would be once in a lifetime, plus, for me personally, something of a last look, I borrowed a Super 8 camera and with one eye glued to the black and white viewfinder, recorded hours of shaky footage, documenting every stage of the journey, the good, the bad, and even the very ugly. I had no idea of what I was doing. The unedited tapes were transferred to VHS and stored. Degradation of the tapes during storage introduced distortion, black squiggles, and psychedelic rainbows to the video at regular intervals. Digitizing and editing this footage now, 20 years later, is something of an experiment, a make do and mend approach, a bit like kintsugi. I am hoping that by cutting out most of the damaged areas, adding a clear narrative track, and dividing the content into single topic videos, of which this is the first, that the shaky low-resolution footage will become intelligible enough to provide a look back at my last look, and serve as a worthwhile record of an extraordinary journey, memorializing and honoring the grace and generosity of our facilitators and instructors, and the curiosity, faith, and fortitude of my fellow travelers, without whom